Over the last 60 years, India and China have never fully resolved their border disputes. And in between those years are several military intervention meetings, ceasefires, intervention from foreign countries, and bloody escalations that have ended in multiple death tolls. In June 2020, for example, over 40 Chinese soldiers and 20 Indian soldiers lost their lives in the bloodiest clash since the Sino-Indian War in 1962. Furious at the loss of their soldiers, India went on a nationwide rampage. They designed riot flags calling for the boycott of China-made goods and burnt several images of Chinese Communist President Xi Jinping before international television. The Narendra Modi-led government appears to have supported the mayhem, as they also issued a list of Chinese companies that were henceforth banned from Indian shores. At the top of the list were WeChat, Alipay, and one of the world's favorite apps, TikTok, which has a third of its total downloads coming from India. Despite the bloody nature of the June 2020 escalation in the Galwan Valley and the publicity it brought to the border disputes, Indian and Chinese border soldiers would yet again engage each other in a duel on December 9, 2022. The curious part about this border crisis is that these guys aren't allowed to take up arms with each other. Instead, they use clubs, wood with nails hammered into them, bricks, sticks, and any object that can soothe their 6-decade-long aggression. Fortunately, neither country has threatened the other with the use of nuclear weapons, which, if it should happen, might signal the beginning of a Third World War. But since it hasn't happened, we can lean on the suggestions of Chinese analysts that both President Xi and Prime Minister Modi are capable of containing the conflict. Moreover, some say the presence of nuclear weapons and a history of bloody battles and losses are likely to keep them from going to war. But China does not believe in the possibility of a nuclear war with India. As a matter of fact, Beijing believes a nuclear war is more likely to happen between India and Pakistan due to their recent troubles. China and Pakistan have been close pals for a while now, and experts have been mindful of China's involvement, if any, in the Indo-Pakistan conflict. Now, the border dispute between Beijing and New Delhi dates back to the first conflict in 1962, and both nations have been fighting over several territories scattered around their borders. Aksai Chin, for example, is claimed as part of the Xinjiang Uyghur and Tibet autonomous regions by the CCP. Meanwhile, India insists the same territory is part of Ladakh, which itself is a part of the Kashmir region. Sources say the disagreement over whose territory Aksai Chin actually belongs to and the construction of a 1,200-kilometer road on the Aksai Chin by China that linked Tibet and Xinjiang, both Chinese territories, provoked the border conflict. As a matter of fact, the road had been built since the early 1950s, but India only got wind of it in 1957. The other disputed territory lies south of the McMahon Line, located in Arunachal Pradesh. Back in 1914, the McMahon Line evolved out of a treaty between Great Britain, China, and Tibet, also called the Simla Convention. However, China refused to honor the agreement that emphasized Tibet's status and borders. The Chinese government argued that Tibet wasn't independent when the treaty was signed and therefore refused to sign the final map, where the agreed borders were lined out. Tibet later signed a 17-point agreement with China in 1951 that stated practical measures for the peaceful liberation of Tibet. The 14th Dalai Lama, or spiritual leader of Tibet, Tenzin Gyatso, validated the agreement on October 1951 via a telegraph, but he would later reject the same agreement in April 1959, insisting that Tibet had been under duress, or in clearer terms, under the threat of the Chinese military when it signed the initial agreement. An uprising began in Tibet's capital, Lhasa, on March 10, 1959, and was led by thousands of Tibet women who wanted to prevent the arrest of the Dalai Lama. On March 17th, a surrounding area of the Dalai Lama's palace was greeted by 2 artillery shells from China. The Dalai Lama, still very young at the time, fled with his family and a few officials the following night until he was guided safely to the Indian border. There, he proclaimed Tibet's independence and was granted asylum by the Indian government. India's involvement infuriated China, and it resulted in several brutal border skirmishes, most you now know about. The dispute then intensified when New Delhi refused all diplomatic solutions put forward by China. And in October 1962, China invaded the disputed territories along the Ladakh border and those which lie across the McMahon Line on the northeastern border. The Chinese military succeeded in pushing back the Indians far from the disputed territories until China suddenly ended their invasion on November 20th, 1962, and withdrew behind the line of actual control that demarcated both countries. Unfortunately, that was the beginning of a 6-decade-long conflict. Let's head down memory lane. On September 11, 1967, China attacked all Indian posts in Nathula. The attack went on for about 5 days before it quelled. The following month, both militaries had another face-off in Chola, a mountain pass that connects India's Sikkim and China's Tibet autonomous regions. That duel only lasted a day. Sources say that India was able to push back China successfully through a decisive tactical advantage. Several Chinese bulwarks were destroyed and the PLA forces were expelled from Indian territories. It was a major win for New Delhi after they had suffered a tragic defeat in 1962. The Indian casualties in the Nathula and Chola skirmishes were only a few hundred compared to the thousands lost in 1962. To date, both sides continue to shift blame between themselves regarding which side actually provoked that conflict. Well, 2 decades after the violent skirmishes in Nathula and Chola, a third military confrontation happened between the PLA ground force and India at Sumarongchi Valley. Also, the Indian government reported that on October 20th, 1975, a non-commissioned officer and 4 other soldiers were ambushed and killed by about 40 Chinese soldiers during a patrol within the Indian territory. China responded to the accusation by insisting the said area was Chinese territory. And that matter ended with protests from New Delhi against Beijing and more military presence along the border. In September 2014, both military forces had another deadlocked confrontation at the line of actual control when Chinese residents in the border village of Demchok and Ladakh protested against a canal being constructed by Indian workers. The confrontation lasted for 21 days, after which Beijing and New Delhi both agreed to withdraw their troops. And yet again on September 15, 2015. Why does everything happen in September? Well, both sides had another brush in the Birdsea region of northern Ladakh when Indian troops knocked down a Chinese watchtower that was built on an agreed patrolling line. In June of that same year, another standoff happened in Doklam, a disputed territory near the Dokala Pass. And a year later, China began constructing a road below Dokala, which the Indian forces in the nearby Bhutanese Royal Army claimed to be disputed territory. Indian military forces disrupted the Chinese construction on the 18th of June, insisting that Beijing violated a series of written agreements made in 1988 and 1998. However, China still claimed ownership of the same territory. Both sides seemed to come to a conclusion in the months that followed, but later on, India stated that they had agreed to an expeditious disengagement in the Doklam region. Next were the more recent conflicts that occurred in 2020 and 2022. Ever since the Chinese activities at the border, India has taken several steps, out of frustration, that are aimed at curbing Chinese influence in India. But I think this is a retaliation from New Delhi. For instance, India is concerned about its economic dependence on China. To this effect, Prime Minister Modi has emphasized Atmanirbharta, translated as self-reliance, to reduce India's economic dependence on China. In simpler terms, imports from China will come to an end, and according to the Indian Minister for Road Transport, Highways and MSME, Nitin Gadkari, Chinese companies will be barred from future road construction projects in India. Also, New Delhi is trying its best to ensure Chinese goods aren't routed through third countries. In addition to these are rumors that Indian state-owned oil companies will no longer use Chinese tankers in shipping crude oil or petroleum products. To add to this whole lot, incentives are being put in place by the Indian government to enable foreign and Indian companies to manufacture in China. We're talking solar power, electronics, and pharmaceuticals. Everything put together feels like a full-blown war against China. Although this time, New Delhi wouldn't be taking up arms or sticks or clubs, and definitely not bricks. India's response didn't take many people by surprise, and some say it has taken them too long to make a solid stand against China. We haven't even talked about how the border crisis has influenced new policies in the telecommunication partnerships between Indian and Chinese companies. BSNL and MTNL, which happen to be popular state-owned firms, have repudiated a previous tender to upgrade their 4G networks. A revised tender is aimed at excluding Chinese telecommunication companies Huawei and ZTE from participating in the bid process. China, on the other hand, isn't going down without a fight. The CCP has issued warnings, persuasions, and objections, and may resort to retaliation or legal actions against India. Mr. Sun Weidong, the Chinese ambassador to India, has warned that the forced decoupling of the Chinese and Indian economies will only lead to a lose-lose outcome. And apart from that, he adds that Indian restrictions violate market laws and World Trade Organization rules. Now the question is, has India finally gotten China's full attention? And does it signify an end to the border conflicts and perhaps a step in time to a third world war? Tell us your thoughts in the comment section below, and we'll see you in the next video.